Welcome to the Weekend Sports Cars on the Marshall Pruett podcast, presented by Cooper Tires and supported through October by PNC Bank. Welcome in to my co-pilot, dear friend, and ace sports car reporter, the editor of dailysportscar.com, Graham Goodwin.
Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're on the world, and you catch up with me as we just prepare to head on to Silverstone for the weekend's beloved doubleheader.
Oh, you said ketchup. Now I want a hamburger because it's kind of that crunch time here. Sorry, predictable
Saucy.
Response. Yes. Well, Mr. Goodwin, we've got a lot of fun coming in terms of IMSA, VIR, the finale of it, I guess, if you want to call a two-race thing on the calendar a finale, but the second of its two GT-only events coming up at the just gorgeous Virginia International Raceway, another North American venue that we must get you to. I have heard rumor that we have sporty cars that are getting ready to play somewhat close to your backyard in Silverstone this weekend. We have Jamie Whincup coming to play in IMSA a little bit later, a little under a month from now. We have some interesting developments on the Daytona Prototype International front, both Cadillac nominating a new team to join the family, Nissan, particularly through the Extreme Speed Motorsports team, mentioning some things both about exclusivity clauses with their DPIs going forward, and also the team itself on its search for replacement for Tequila Patron. And what did we do last week, Graham? To kick things off, we decided we're going to do a test run on a new format, and that was essentially minimize the analysis up front and just do the analysis via listener questions. And from the feedback I received, it seemed like folks said do more of that. So what are we going to do this time, my friend?
I think that's exactly where we're going to do it, because we've got more questions than ever to get through. There's one other talking point, by the way, breaking just this afternoon before we recorded this, and this one I'm sure will be a crossover into your Weekend IndyCar podcast, and that is that Fernando Alonso has announced that he will be stepping down from Formula One at the end of this season. That means he's going to be concentrating on his WEC program with Toyota, and I've zero doubts that you'll be seeing him throughout the month of May next year, MP.
I've never heard of the guy, so thanks. I'm going to go look him up.
Spanish. Reasonably quick.
Spanish. Interesting. Going to look this guy up for sure.
It's near Portugal.
Yeah, that's an interesting one too, and it seems like, at least for some of what was written about good old Fred, some might have forgotten that he does indeed still have his WEC obligations with Toyota, so while he might not be in a Formula One car next year, it's not as if his calendar doesn't already have a couple of dates in position. PNC is proud to sponsor Scott Dixon, driver of the number 9 car for Chip Ganassi Racing. Everyone tunes in on race day, but so much of the race is determined off camera during the work put in throughout the week, month, and year. From the gym to the practice track, Scott Dixon and the team take small steps every day to get closer to victory lane. Copyright 2018, the PNC Financial Services Group Incorporated. All rights reserved. PNC Bank, National Association, member FDIC. Where, my friend, do you think we should start off with the questions of the week with all the various topics we already mentioned?
Well, kick off with a little bit of Silverstone. It is back to action for the WEC for the first time in a couple of months. It's a double header with the very excellent European Le Mans Series at Silverstone, both on the main Grand Prix circuit, but in different pit lanes and paddocks, which has its logistical issues for everybody concerned. But lots of storylines coming out of that, including some nips, tucks, and shifts in driver squads. We'll see Ant Davidson make his LMP2 debut this coming weekend for Dragon Speed. But unsurprisingly, MP, a lot of the questions that have been coming our way are on the subject of LMP1. on. It's the top formula. It's the formula that is now unique to the World Endurance Championship, and a number of questions coming out about some of the choices going forward, some of the storylines that have been emerging over the last week or two in terms of even further down the line in the hypercar regulations. Let's kick off with Enrique Brand's question, though. With the issues surrounding TRSM Ginetta switching to AER engines, are there any rumours or inquiries of other potential teams running the Ginettas with the Gibson LMP1 engine? Seems like Rebellion is the only privateer that's not had serious issues with their package. Thanks again, providing an amazing podcast. Thank you very much, Enrique. Makes me look forward to my commute. It must be good. There you go. Well, okay. The answer is the Gibson engine certainly turned a few heads. The first person to talk to me in any depth about it was one Elton Julian. Indeed, was the launch customer for that engine for Dragon Speed. Their issues have not been engine related for their BR1 chassis, but certainly I think the Gibson has caught the imagination of some. I can tell you, and this is not something I've written down anywhere yet.
Ooh, scoop, yes, breaking, exclusive!
That I have been talking to somebody not currently in LMP1 about the Gibson engine in a chassis in which it is not currently fitted. I'm saying no more than that. And by the way, this is a million billion light years away from confirmation of a new LMP1 package, but I think listeners should be aware that whilst I think we are essentially where we are for the moment in LMP1, and that, by the way, does include the very high likelihood the Ginettas being back, or at least one Ginetta being back with an AER engine later this season, that the marketplace does have a little bit of movement. People are talking about programs with the current technology and then forward into hypercar, whatever we're going to get that thing called. That, by the way, should be the first thing to decide is what the heck do we call this thing for 2021, 2022. But there are still people out there talking about bringing cars to the World Endurance Championship perhaps later this year and certainly into next season. So the answer, Enrique, is I can give you a partial answer. The answer is yes, people are talking about yet more mix and match with the current chassis and the current engine choices.
Well, as our steady listeners have come to learn, and hopefully for those of you who are new listeners to the podcast, and we would ask those of you who've been here for a little while, we're, what, Graham, about 7-ish, well, maybe 7 months, 6-7 months into this. If you like it, please share it, because we're trying to grow it, and we'll maybe go into further detail in the weeks ahead, but if you have been familiar to hearing Graham and I speak about sports cars on a weekly basis via podcast, you're probably deducing this is might be one of the only, if not the only, places where that is happening. But if you like it, please share it, because we get great questions, like the first one that came in from Enrique. And then we also get great questions you've become familiar with and are sending in that are just downright silly. So we try and have fun with what we do here. And our friend Right Turn Lover, piggybacking on last week's little thing where I went in on, I didn't sharpen the knife too much, I hope, Graham, but mentioned that a tweet from a certain manufacturer, and I'll go ahead and say it was Lexus, from one of their drivers saying that the close to the GTD race at Road America was a literal dogfight. At the end of the day, well, it wasn't literal, but regardless, Right Turn Lover wrote in and said, if you would want a race to be a literal dogfight, which breeds would you put behind the wheel of which car? Any specific teams or sponsors you'd be hoping for? He says, I'd not let them race until the end of the day. Cass would be much better at that. So all brilliant stuff there, Right Turn Lover. What comes to mind, Mr. Goodwin? What breed and what car?
Now that's a big call, isn't it? I might have to kind of have a think about that one, because the puns...
Greyhound might be, you might
Whip
think
it.
speed, a whip it, something, but, would they be strong enough to wheel a big GT car? I mean, I realize there's power steering involved, but, do you go with a breed that's known for its speed, its brains, agility? I mean, the one that comes to I don't know if this is right, but one thing I'm thinking I would avoid is one that drools heavily, because who wants to be the second dog in
No.
after?
It's Johnny Herbert-like, isn't it, in the driving seat? Really. I mean, there's
Yo.
the Alan McNish-like Terrier.
Oh,
There's that.
yep.
So the kind of little Westie Terrier. You're looking for something that's scrappy but intelligent, which completely puts McNish out of the picture.
No, not at all. That guy's gone. He's too smart enough to refuel a car, much less drive one these days. So perfect.
Fantastic. It's a good one, isn't it?
Yeah. Boy, we might even be stumped just on our second question. But
we might come back to that.
well, I might be leaning towards a Rottweiler, Doberman Pinscher, something. I don't know. Germanish, possibly, that would fit. Lots of sports cars are German. One that maybe has exhibited great control and discipline. So, Rottweiler a little bit bigger, a little bit huskier.
AJ Foyt's got that American pit bull look around him, hasn't he?
Yeah. So this is one that probably is going to stump us more than some of the others. That is for sure. And we'll try and come back if we have better ideas. And as always, we need some sort of response, whether it's a hashtag on Facebook or Twitter. Give us some ideas. What breed of dog would you put behind which type of car? We didn't even get to what type of car. I think we might be poorly qualified here. And as a cat owner, yeah.
Cats are better anyway.
I think so. And why don't I grab one other here that fits the mildly pet peevish phrasing coming off of our, at the end of the day, literal dogfight. Our pal Steve Smith Jr. sends in. He says, "Daggone it, down at the bottom of the list again. Nope, we moved you towards the top, Steve." He says, "Oh well, here's my question for this week. In your personal opinions, how do you think IMSA's current classes stack up against the old GTP, GTO, GTU system? And how do you think today's car would fare under the old system? What would you think about bringing the old system back?" First of all, and this is out of pure love, Steve, while I mentioned last week that the phrase "at the end of the day" drives me nuts, the new thing, because that one's been around for a long time, although it's become popular in recent years, the new one that is just wearing me out is either in your personal opinions or me personally. First of all, I've never expressed a non-personal opinion for the most part. So, well, if I were Abraham Lincoln, my thoughts on the subject would be, I can't do that. I am incapable there. The me personally one, that one, Graham, and I realize that Steve didn't say this, so I'm co-opting the personal opinions thing a little bit. That one drives me mad. It's essentially saying me, or I, twice. Me personally. Well, you impersonally? You don't need the me personally part. You don't need the personally part. We get the me. Me, I would do this just fine. I would do that. Me personally? I just want to shake people. But of course, I'm sure with whatever turns of phrases that come out of my large flappy mouth, folks also want to grab my shoulders and shake me until I am unconscious. So please
it's an interpersonal thing, isn't it? It's an interpersonal thing.
Well,
I'm listening and thinking, just how fabulous Mrs. Pruett's life must be.
Oh, poor thing. At least I think, on a little bit of a retro phrasial pet peeve standpoint, the yeah, no, which seemed to be the go-to response whenever you'd ask a driver a question for a couple years there. Hey, did you think that pass into turn 4 was fair? Yeah, no. And then you'd get the answer and you go, how did you just cover yes and no and then give the answer we were looking for? At least that one seems like it's on the way out. It's not as if I pay attention to these things. No. I don't have OCD, damn it. I don't. But I am going to put all these pencils in.
I can tell you now, for those, and we do know that some drivers do listen in, and we thank you for it, boys and girls. But I do keep a log in every press conference of the number of for sures that actually come up. It was a Michael Schumacher thing to start with, but it does seem to be something that's spread far and wide across the world. But for sures. Record, by the way, was at a WC press conference in Japan 2 years ago. It was 16.
Wow.
16. shores. It's an average of about 5 to 7, but 16 is the record for shores.
I think we need to come up with...
I think it's got to be a hashtag.
That or a press conference phrasing T-shirt, so we can have at the end of the day, it is what it is. Me personally, yeah, no. I think there's something there. Maybe. I'd only sell one, probably to myself.
Merchandising line.
Okay, so we've spun off the rails 3 questions in already. Back to your question, Steve, and I apologize for co-opting your personal opinions statement there. Keep in mind there was also a third class that was GTP Lights. So there are actually 4 classes. And, all right, let me spin off the rails just a little bit more. You read some comments from some folks, Graham, about IMSA and having 3 classes now, going back up to 4 classes. You read about before they got rid of the PC class for 2018, how 4 classes were too many. Folks had a hard time following, couldn't understand. That was something leveled at the American Le Mans Series for many years by, I think, those who were fans of Grand Am, which simply had Daytona Prototype and Rolex GT. I do try and remind folks that the most popular sports car series North America has ever had took place in the 1980s with IMSA, and at its absolute peak, it had 4 classes. And I cannot recall reading a thing. I actually worked in the series for 1 year on a smaller GTP team in 1990, which, and for some of us, we regard that as kind of the peak season of overall popularity. I cannot recall anyone saying, when IMSA was the raging monster that it was, that 4 classes were too many. It was too hard to follow. And this is also pre-internet, my friend. This was pre-colored end plates and LED panels to tell you what position they were in. I mean, this is truly informational dark ages. Yet folks seem to just really love what they had. So, sorry for the little rant here, but when I hear folks today, when I think we're smarter than we've ever been, and we won't get into political discussions and who we've elected as our leaders internationally, but I think we're smarter as a people than ever. We have more information available to us than ever, and yet I hear some folks say that four classes, how could you manage? That's keeping fans from tuning in, and that's keeping sports car less popular than it could be. And you go, well, I've seen the exact opposite be true and happened to live through it, so maybe that's something worth considering. As for your concept of how do I think today's cars would fare under the old system, Steve, I think they'd be amazing. Keep in mind, it is the same exact system that IMSA used back in the day for the most part, minus or with the addition of balance of performance. Here is your engine displacement and or induction options. Here's a general weight that is attached to that. Pick what you want, and this is where you would come out in regulation formula of what to build. We're not that far away from that. I realize that there are minimum weights that are established up front when you're building an LMP2 car, a whatever car that is being assembled. But if we look at the GT vehicles, GT Le Mans specifically, even GT3, they all have different weights, they all have different displacements, they all make different amounts of power, they all carry different amounts of ballast. Their fuel capacities are sized differently to accommodate whether they burn more fuel or less. It's not that different, honestly, of the way that it was before, Steve. It was a little more pure in the pick your displacement and whether it's turbo, non-turbo, and that corresponds to a particular weight. But beyond that, the one thing we've done that is different is say, all right, now we're going to try and balance all of you after you've made those decisions. So I think if we just took this current formula, swapped it out with the old Graham, I think folks would be pretty happy. We'd also have the clear best cars in each category coming out on top at whichever tracks were best for their whatever package they decided was the one for them. So we have this. It just has this artificial layer on top that strips out, showing the purity of who came up with the best idea.
I think that's absolutely right, and that's the same around the world. What it's given us, before we get into the kind of the pure racing kind of aspects, which I have to say, a firm student, what it's given us, generally speaking, are larger and more stable grids over a longer period of time in general, particularly in GT racing. What it's taken away, you're quite right, is that opportunity for somebody to just steal a march on the rest and, do what teams have done down through the years, which is turn up and made the rest of the guys look like they weren't trying. And I sort of miss that aspect of it. But I completely understand why in this day and age, in the economic situation that is still global, why you would wish to go down the road of ensuring that you're, putting insurance, if you like, on your basic grid numbers. We miss something, without a shadow of a doubt. We miss, as you said previously on the show, Marshall, we miss that aspect of that group of guys and girls at the local speed shop being able to put together a program by themselves and turn up with something just completely left field. We all miss that, and there needs to be a place for that in racing. But generally speaking, you've got a more stable grid across these extremely expensive national, continental and global series, and for that there's definite plus to that artificial kind of layer. We're going to run on here, MP, because I spotted the opportunity to just run 4 questions together.
Wow.
GTE, Justin Walsh, Don Gregory, Mike Goodyear, all 3 of them asking about the recent sightings that have been made for the new Corvette C8R in testing, and beyond that, asking about the sound, by the way, and what we think the performance might be. Matt Wolf actually saying, putting the new Corvette C8R aside, even before it's raced, putting it aside, do we worry about the future of GTE with the imminent departure of Ford and also the ACO's hypercar prototype rules pushing more manufacturers to look at that class instead of future GTE programs? So, thoughts on Corvette? You've been a lot closer to that story than I have thus far, MP.
I would say for sure there should be concerns held by the fans, and I would say both sides of the Atlantic in terms of the French ACO/FIA WEC and IMSA in terms of future regulations. Little bit of a addition to this before we get into the specific GT side. We're looking at something where the thought that IMSA and ACO/FIA would head in the same direction on the 2020 LMP1 top-tier prototype regulations, that looked like something that could be awesome and unite the different sanctioning bodies in this regard better than we've seen in a super long time. That hasn't happened. And I believe we're going to end up in a place that many folks believe as well, where IMSA is going to be the DPI sanctioning body. That's our top class. Cool. You guys do hypercars, whatever you want, but we're no longer going to opt in with what you're doing. I don't think that option to go rogue, if you want to put it that way, Graham, I don't think that exists in GTLM for IMSA. Because if we look at the reason why production-based racing factory efforts exist, Le Mans is a huge part of it. You can't come across a single GTLM effort in IMSA that does not have some form of Le Mans component. And whether it's the teams themselves heading over to Le Mans with their cars, or just the brand that is taking part in IMSA also having a representation in GTE-Pro, we know that Le Mans might be something that on the prototype level with DPIs that manufacturers in North America are willing to live without for the next couple of years. I don't believe that's the case in GTLM. I don't think that could really ever be taken off the board. So with all that said, it does concern me, honestly, about where this could head. What does the ACO and FIA truly plan on doing with its GT cars? And is that something that among the 2 North American manufacturers currently involved, Corvette and Ford, where they could see value in that in the years to come? We know Corvette has a new car, C8, Sounds like it's turbo V8. We know that they have something new in the works. Looks pretty awesome. Have had the spy shots here and worked them up into some colored kind of call-outs of some of the differences, which you can see on roadandtrack.com. On the Ford side, I'm probably a day away from publishing a piece on where I'm very confident its GTLM and its DPI interests could be headed. But yeah, I am concerned, because if you think about this, Graham, this Corvette is awesome. Whatever Corvette is doing is awesome, even if folks don't like it as a mid-engine car. I'm a firm believer that if a factory is going to remain engaged and spend money and be there, you got to celebrate it. That has to hold value. Where I am concerned, though, is if we look like we might be taking Ford GTs off the board at the end of 2019, at least as a factory effort. And as we've seen the Risi Ferrari team, we don't know if, we hope they will be back for one or more races before the end of the season, but we don't know if the Italian marque is going to be a consistent player in any way, at least in North America. Could we be heading into 2020 with Porsche, Corvette, and BMW as 6 cars? A 6-car GTLM class. That's at least the thing that I fear. And knowing that we're not 100% sure on where the future GTE-Pro / GTLM regulations will end up, could that lead other manufacturers to shy away and leave us with a small grid? Or could that be something that encourages others to come in? It's that question mark that has me put off a little bit. What do you think from the European side, Graham?
I think for me, it's a worry more than anything else. I mean, there was an inevitability that the Corvette would be heading in that direction, and I think that's the concern. We talked on a show, must be about a month or so ago, about that journey that LMP1H made from when we had 3 factory teams with very different power plants and very different hybrid solutions. That journey where all 3 had more similar power plants and certainly very similar hybrid solutions. And it feels to me, certainly in terms of the engine technology and the solutions that are being found there, is we're heading to a place where a turbocharged V8 is, frankly, their get out of jail free card, with being the place that you need to be. And unfortunately, that's likely become the case because of balance of performance. Because actually, that's where you get the best opportunity to get the best blend of performance from across the range. And it may very well be that the Porsche 911 RSR is the last man standing in GTE that's not running a turbocharged V8. And from my perspective, the kind of passionate part that fuels me at the races, that's disappointing, because frankly the soundtrack for them is not very inspirational. When you've been used to Ferrari 458s and 430s before that, when you've been used to Corvette C6s, C5s, C7s, and used to the glorious Aston Martin V8 Vantage GTE, these are fantastically effective power plants, but they're not floating that boat for me. And that, I think, is where we're heading. We're heading into a position where electrification hasn't hit GTE, but I'll tell you something, efficiency absolutely has. And it's becoming more and more and more important, which makes it all the more ridiculous that we're getting into an era where sanctioning bodies feel the need to put things like lap caps on GTE stints. So I just get the feeling we're heading to a watershed. Quite what that watershed looks like, whether or not that's regulatory led in terms of whether or not it's Aston Martin or another manufacturer deciding they're going to do one thing or another, whether or not they're trying to push customer racing into GTE rather than GT3, whatever they're trying to do, whether it's that side or whether it's a technology-led decision, I think we're heading to a watershed. We talked a couple of weeks ago about SRO World and GT2. I'm aware right now of at least 4 manufacturers with either products almost ready to go or active consideration of products for GT2. We're heading to a different place for GT racing in the very near future. And GTE is going to have to find its place in that. I will admit to being disappointed by the C8R. Why? Because I think whilst it's a fabulous looking thing as a race or a road car, it's a bit samey. You put a different grille on the front, it could be the NSX. You put a slightly different air intake on the side, it could be any number of other cars. And it disappoints me at the moment with what little we've seen, that it's not something that when you see it on the streets, on the track, in the paddock, you can point at it and think, that's a Corvette. And I don't want this to come across as knocking Corvette. I don't think they have an option at this stage to retain its level of competitiveness that they've been used to, but that's faded away at Le Mans in more recent years. They've clearly got to reinvent the bow tie. And on this occasion, it's leaving me, someone who loves Corvettes more than words can say, and particularly its racing versions, a little bit on the underwhelmed side.
And let me add to that, Graham, and it even calls back a little bit to Stephen Smith's question about the old IMSA formulas and whether those would work today. I don't know if our friends Gerard Neveu, Pierre Fillon, Vincent Beaumenil, if others at the ACOFRA happen to tune in to our little show here, but I will mention that not only do I completely agree with you, Graham, on the fact that current GTE-Pro, I guess even AM, but effectively the GTE/GTLM framework, if I'm just thinking forward, it is absolutely ripe for, frankly, the hypercar-minded approach they have expressed in wanting to do for the top-tier prototype class. And I'm not talking about the insane budgets and all of that kind of stuff, but we're getting more questions on a weekly basis, Graham, from listeners who say, hey, and I think we might even have the one this week that says, hey, Trans Am seems like it's gaining in popularity again. Do you think silhouette style racing could ever be a thing, a truly popular thing? I'm not saying that I believe GTE/GTLM needs to go down a tube frame silhouette type direction, because I think that would be too far for the comfort zone of manufacturers that at least I've gotten a feeling from. But I do think there might be something in between where we retain the production-based angle, allow more dramatic bodywork, wider, nastier, something where you look at it, something that does make the Lamborghini Aventador or Bugatti Chiron or whatever, some of these crazy hypercars that folks drool over and say, what can we do to allow freedom of bodywork design to take these production-based GTE/GTLM cars and make them so dramatic that no one will care about what's on the road. They're going to want to come to the track and look at these because they're so amazing. They're just visually stunning. That does take a bit of a cue from 1980s GTO, even GTU just a little bit. Something where it was more, back then at least, it was folks making bodies out of fiberglass, meaning that these were not, they might have started off with a vague shape of whatever their production roots were, but they were made extreme. We have all the bodywork now essentially made out of carbon fiber, so the same work is taking place. It's just conforming incredibly closely to the production models themselves. So I think, Graham, one thing just to consider, if we're looking however many years down the future for whatever GTE and GTLM might evolve into, think about the looks. Think about the fact that there are road cars that look so much better than the race cars that maybe you need to fix that and invert that. The other thing I'll add too, and this is taking another page from the old GTO and GTU classes that IMSA had in the 80s and early 90s. If you look at GTO, for example, Cal Choquette was his name. He ran the factory Dodge Daytona GTU effort. And the cars looked amazing, but they also went through some pretty serious evolutions and iterations based on what they felt might be most successful. So just looking through my own archives, I have photos of a front-wheel drive 4-cylinder turbo Dodge Daytona, and I also have photos of a rear-wheel drive car. And there was no massive rehomologation thing. Oh, the car's not eligible for that until the end of the super season. They, as a manufacturer, had the regulation freedom to say, we want to try this out. And yeah, it's going to cost us some money, but we're already here. We think this might be the best way. And who knows? Maybe this can serve our future road cars in some way. And if it doesn't, then we want to have the freedom to go back and try the rear-wheel drive, for example, and come up with what is best. That part, Graham, as you well know, that's been stripped out. You've effectively write out your recipe up front, get it homologated, and you are, for the most part, stuck for the life of the car, barring a few small changes here or there. I think if we want to talk about success in top-level professional GT racing in the future, A, we need to get the looks right, and B, giving manufacturers some freedom to play and evolve. I think that would endear more manufacturers to either stay or more manufacturers to come in. But when you paint them to such a tight and multi-year small box, that's where my concern comes in. I don't know if that model's going to keep working into the next decade.
Well, it was Daniel Tripp that asked about whether or not with PwC going to endurance light format, might that be Trans Am's opportunity to return to its former glory? Not sure about that, but certainly it's got real attraction, doesn't it? There's a counterpoint, by the way, European counterpoint to your that very point you said about the Dodge Daytona. Back in the glory days of super touring in the British Touring Car Championship, none other than Andy Rouse put together a Ford Mondeo super touring car and ran it in prototype form as a rear-wheel drive car, and was allowed to do that because the base model was available as a four-wheel drive car. You could only have two-wheel drive for any of the super touring models, but in that instance you could choose whether or not it was a front or a rear-wheel drive car. Eventually ran the thing as a front-wheel drive car and conformed to much everybody else. But you're right, that templating just seems to get tighter and tighter and tighter. It's this homogenization, isn't it, of just the everything around it, which you do sort of wonder whether or not there's a bit of a blind alley. The other counterpoint I'd say is this about this. You're absolutely spot on, by the way, about the look of the cars, and I think they've got that. I think the early kind of thoughts of Pierre Fillon recorded in some French magazine interviews made it very clear he was looking for a return to those bonkers late 90s GT1 looks that you could tell that was a Mercedes, although it's not like any Mercedes-Benz you ever seen on the streets. They were the very first cars, by the way, that I decided to take my young son and travel some distance to go and watch racing, because they were the cars that did it for me. And I think they get it, that they need to return to those days. Whether or not they've got it right and they've chosen to go with effectively whatever replaces LMP1 rather than effectively whatever replaces GTE, we're going to find out in a remarkably short period of time, because we're going to start to have to hear pretty quickly the direction that those regulations are taking, if there's going to be any chance of those manufacturers getting on track for the planned time frame. I'm already hearing it may slip a little, but the planned time frame, which is 2021 for the 2022 Le Mans 24 Hours.
Wow. Well, where do we go next, my friend?
Well, let's have a crack at some DPI goodness, shall we? Because there's plenty there. My gosh, there's a lot of questions this time. Here's a good one from Kevin Perez Frederico. Hello, Kevin. Hello, guys. With next year's prototype cars getting Michelin tyres, will the tyres be tailor-made for each individual needs of DPI P2, similar to GTLM, or one-size-fits-all situation? Have you had a chance to catch up with our good friends Michelin USA yet, MP?
I sent an email asking for an answer on that, Kev, specifically because of your question, and the response was, and still is, forthcoming. So I hope to, keep in mind that Michelin is known for longevity with their products. So maybe this is just a quadruple stint in terms of getting a reply back. So I don't have an answer. It would be interesting to see how they go about this, and I do absolutely, and this is one of those duh statements, but I am genuinely interested in learning what they have planned, Kevin, because if you think about the power plants in use on the prototype side, yes, we have known LMP2 chassis that may or may not have used Michelin customerish rubber in running in Europe. But if we think about the DPIs, we have everything from a very tiny four-cylinder and light Mazda engine to a big 5.5-liter V8 in the back of the Cadillacs. So from a balance standpoint, from where that weight sits in the car and how it might consume tires, it will be interesting to see if and how Michelin goes about a little bit of customization, or if they just try and find the best center point that works at both ends with the Mazda and Cadillac and with the twin-turbo V6s of Nissan and Acura in the middle. So don't know. If we at least go off of a little bit of history, and this is only in the ALMS when there was not a spec solution, we do know that Michelin spent a ton of time and a ton of money to see that each manufacturer had a little something that fit them the best. Don't know if that would be the case here in a spec world, but we will soon find out.
There's a couple more questions. There's another DPI theme, and it's one that I know you've written about the last few days. It's definitely one for you, and it's two on the general subject of Nissan and DPI. We go with Mihai Farhat says, if ESM can't find the sponsors needed for next year's, will the two cars be sold off or not? Considering ESM have some sort of exclusivity on Nissan DPIs, I guess Nissan would have at least some interest in the cars running in the series, even if not with ESM. Beyond that, there's a separate question from David Faulkner. Why is the Ligier Nismo deal using the GTR GT3 twin-turbo V6? Would it not make more sense to use the V8s in LMP3 cars? Tell you what, you have a crack with the first one. I'll come back to the LMP3 point because it's an interesting and rather newsy point I'll give the listeners on this one.
Great. Well, interesting question, and I appreciate this being sent in because a lot of what we get as well happen to fall in the inside baseball minutia, and this is honestly, it's a great question just because it's a bit of a wider one, maybe for those who are learning more about the sport. Keep in mind that in an LMP3 car that might be matching the speed of a GT3 car, well, the reason being is we have an incredibly light carbon fiber prototype using LMP3 prototype using a Nissan V8 that is not asked to put out a ton of horsepower. If we're talking about setting similar speeds, we would then have a GT3-based production car that is undoubtedly heavier and makes a lot more power to try and compensate for the extra heft. So if we're just talking theoretical, if both cars were setting identical lap times, the reason that the LMP3 would be in that range more because of the lightness than the actual power the V8 is putting out. So when it comes to the DPI side, the twin-turbo V6 coming out of the GTR road car model, which can make 6, 7, many hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of horsepower, that would be the place to go. The V8, which is in the, I forget, Graham, 400-ish, maybe 450, 425, something.
What the P3? It's mid 400s, mid 400s.
It's about 200 horsepower less than what is needed to be competitive in DPI. And at least from what I know, I'm not confident the LMP3 motor is something that has ever been rated for, call it 650 horsepower over a 24-hour span.
No, it's a lazy sort of production-based V8 with a limited production life out of it. Remember, we've got a new homologation period coming for LMP3. And this comes off the back of, you may or may not remember that 2 years ago, there was a proposal that there might be an extra 40 or 50 horsepower added to LMP3, and they decided not to do that. They decided for no small reason that they were concerns about what that would do to running costs and reliability for those engines. So the thought you could add 200 horsepower, forget it. That engine is going to have a very limited shelf life in LMP3, and I expect that when we see the new homologation, which will be, by the way, more powerful cars with, because that's the way these things go, better aerodynamics, that you're going to probably see a new engine as well. Watch this space.
Ooh. Well, who are you beating up in the background, or is someone wrestling?
Oh, that was just a door. That was just a door shutting as Lordy delivered me a Heineken.
Aw, Lordy, one of sports car racing's finest photographers, by the way.
Oh, just been showing me, by the way, some of his albums of 1980s and 1990s stuff in the process of being digitalized. There's going to be some treats to come on Daily Sports Car and elsewhere. Fabulous, fabulous stuff.
Oh, I love it. I look forward to that, and I'm in a perennial. Honestly, brother, I'm in a perennial scanning, trying to get all of my yeah. I don't. My goal is before I die. That's when I'm hoping to get it all done. So,
I'm gonna shift to another GT one here from Tim Saint. Can Japanese GT300 cars be running SRO series outside of Super GT? For that matter, would IMSA ever allow a mother chassis GT300 car to run in GTD? What unassuming car would you build a GT300 spec? His pick, by the way, is the Alpha 4C, or what silhouette would you drape over a dome mother chassis? There is one other championship I can tell you that GT300s are permitted to race in, and that's the Asian Le Mans series. They have had races where some of the GT300s have raced on the odd occasion, but it's on the odd occasion. We're not at a season entry from a GT300 yet, at least. Not expecting one this season either, by the way. As for which car would I put, I'd just put something completely ridiculous. Some of the GT300s, mother chassis stuff based on saloon cars. We've had, obviously, Subaru WRXs and Bretzers, etc. I just think something completely ridiculous, whether or not it's a K car or just something that will turn the head. It doesn't have to be something kind of, swoopy and exotic. For me, there's appeal in doing something like, I don't know, a minivan. Would be actually quite fun. We've seen them before in endurance racing done on Super Touring chassis, but something like that would be, I think, enormous fun. For me, what Toyota have done with the hybridized Prius GT300s, I think, is genius, because it's got a cult following all its own. And when you go to Japan and see some of the kind of the car culture there with, road-going slammed Toyota Priuses, with certainly styling cues that owe a little at least to their GT300 near brethren. I just think that's a bit of genius. It's just, for everyone we've just been talking about for the first part of the show, MP, and that template that exists just about everywhere, mercifully, it doesn't yet exist in the Super GT series, and more power to them.
Me, personally, I would like to see a Mazda Miata. Having engineered, which is a pretty sad conviction of my talents, having engineered and run a number of people in spec Miatas throughout the years, the original generation, even second generation, I look at the car today and just think it's kind of sort of the world's perfect small tuner vehicle. And I have yet to see it blown out into something crazy, like it just had a cattle prod stuck in all kinds of areas, and it just went mad, freaked out, and got wide and long, and all kinds of aero appendages and whatnot. I would love to see what a completely freaked out GT300 based Mazda Miata might look like. So, or I believe MX-5, as it is referred to globally. So that would be my pick, Tim.
Let's have another look further and up and down here. Here's a good one from Jeremy Charette, and apologies, Jeremy, if I've mispronounced that name, but why is Formula One so resistant to an energy-based power unit formula a la WC LMP1? It's been great to see four-cylinder V6, V8 power plants going wheel-to-wheel with incredibly close racing despite the vast differences under the hood. I think it's because, and I'm happy to be shot down in flames here, we come back to templating again. You give the guys with the level of expertise, knowledge, and more to the point, budget that you've got nowadays in Formula One, freedom, and sure as eggs is eggs, somebody's going to find something that blows the rest out the water, and they don't want that to happen anymore. That's not the way the script works moving forward. So I think that's what it comes down to. It is that templating and control aspect of the upper echelon of the sport. You agree, MP?
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree at all. I templating, that is such a lovely word. How's this? And just a little, maybe a 10-second tangent. We are in the midst of a decade, 2 decades of templating being the norm. How about we go back to the non-templating-ish days? Wouldn't that be fun? Things tend to go in cycles in sports cars. Wouldn't it be cool if templating was a word we did not use for the next 10 or 20 years? And then maybe we could when we were old and retired and retiring off of the income from Lordy selling his old scan photos.
Yeah, well, it is a cyclical thing, isn't it? And I think lessons are being learned. Whether or not the correct lessons are actually being learned right now is an interesting one to consider. We're getting into that silly season at the moment where talking about whether or not factory A will do this next year or factory B will do that in 2022, and the factors that might get in the way and the obstacles to a global formula and blah, 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 blah. It's, we could get terribly, terribly excited about it, but I cannot remember any period in my adult life when the same questions were not being asked in some area of the sport. It used to be, from time to time, in Formula One, when we still had V12s and V8s and V10s kicking around. I think those days are long gone, sadly.
I'm going to take one here from Ryan Bauer. It says, with Jim France going over to run NASCAR while Brian France takes care of his problems, do you guys see this having an effect on IMSA, or do they have a plan in place if something like this happens? Keep in mind, Ryan, that IMSA has Ed Bennett as the CEO of IMSA, as he has been for many years, and he is a carryover from having been the CEO and leader of the Grand Am series that NASCAR started and owned, that Jim France started. And with Scott Atherton as president, you have its leadership fully in place, continuing on as they always have, regardless of what Jim is doing now in looking after NASCAR or not. I don't foresee I see there having no impact really on day-to-day whatsoever. I'd also say that with the State of the Series, Graham, having taken place a week and a half ago in Road America, we know what 2019 looks like from a calendar standpoint. We know all of the class structure additions or changes with the Michelin GTD Super Special 7-race non-endurance cup and prototype splitting into 2 classes and so on. So I'd say, Ryan, if we're just looking at the roadmap for the next year, IMSA's in good position. Got Michelin coming in. NBC / NBCSN deal is done for TV. It's rock solid. Where I would see Jim, depending on how long he remains in this NASCAR role, depending on how long that goes, the one area where I think it might have some influence is on the topic of future global regulations, drawing back to the conversation on what the ACO and FIA will end up doing with their hypercar-ish prototype regulations in the other classes that could be adopted or could be altered that IMSA uses in their WeatherTech Sports Car Championship. I know, Graham, from some good, I don't want to call them private conversations, but just some conversations on background, that Jim is really and truly and always the voice of reason and protectionism for IMSA. He founded it 49 years ago, was the bankroller behind it. It was sold, it was brought back in the 90s. I'll just say this. If and when there are major decisions final turning points as to whether IMSA would opt in on these hypercar regulations, which I don't think is going to happen ever, unless the ACO and FIA relent and come back to a DPI formula. But whatever those big final decisions are on future regulatory opting in or opting out for IMSA, I can guarantee you Jim will make time to express his wishes and thoughts and make sure that whatever is best for IMSA will happen, even if he is still running NASCAR on a day-to-day basis. Will he be as plugged in, maybe, along the way? I can't say. But IMSA is his baby. He might be a member of the France family that famously started NASCAR. Jim's a sports car guy, always has been. That is his world. His team, Action Express Racing, currently leading the championship. No matter what's going on in NASCAR, I know that he is going to stay plugged into IMSA. You just hope that he doesn't get so far pulled into the NASCAR thing that he's unable to have his regular imprint on what's happening in IMSA diminished in any way.
It kind of, not quite a neat segue, but there's got some commonality there. But we've come through the last couple of weeks with the State of the Season, State of the Series address from Scott Atherton, which, by the way, I thought was excellently done. Stuart Hart asking what we'd like to hear this WC weekend news-wise. Crunch time, he says, to finalise the GTP regulations. We need to hear from OEMs, constructors, suppliers. New cars need to be ready for teams in about 18 months. Is it time for a State of the Series update from Pierre Fillon and Gerard Neveu? Yeah, I think it is. I think what we need now is confidence moving forward. And I think that template, that idea that you can draw together in a kind of formal but actually not entirely structured manner, a vision for going forward. I know that's what we're supposed to have in June at the Le Mans 24 Hours. It's the wrong time to have it, is the honest answer. I think, this point in the year may be a little early, and the problem is that it's never the best thing to do those things when you're on the other side of the world to most of your audience. So the last opportunity really this season at a race meeting is at Silverstone. But yes, I would like to hear a lot more clarity. I'd also like something else from the WEC, which is I'd like to hear them responding to some of the calls we've had from our listeners, from me and my colleagues in the press room, to a forum for more clarity about some of the technical regulations. I think that's been missing for quite some time. I know why. I know they've been astoundingly busy with a range of things, but I think, it's time now that if this is going to be that important, that we started to hear about some movement in that direction. That's what I'd like to hear, Stuart.
Let me add a question to this of my own, Graham. Do you think the lack of clarity recent months, this year in general, on future prototype regulations, GT regulations, LMP2, do you think that might stem from the fact that they aren't completely sure? I know that they've stated plans and we're going to do hypercar and it's going to be this and projected budget that and blah, blah, blah. But do you think some of the fuzziness is due to the fact that that concept on the P1 side hasn't maybe taken off the way they hoped? And again, part of me wonders if the fuzziness is because they aren't really able to fill in because they aren't sure what they're going to do, or if these things are going to stick. Do you think that could be it? Or part of it?
Yes and no. I think I'd put a different spin on it, if you like. I think what it comes down to is the fact that they've been through some very tough times, having lost two of their foundation teams, and they don't want that journey again. So what they want to do is to do the best job they possibly can in putting a number of major teams in place to make this stick. And maybe they're having some teething difficulties with that. We've all read the stories about who is and isn't in that room, some of which aren't news to anybody that's not been following this for some little time. There's at least two of the manufacturers that were spoken about in a shock, horror, gasp form that haven't been in those meetings for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks before then. But it is around two things. One is clarity about the journey, and two is giving these guys room to breathe Okay, it's a conversation I recently had with somebody about my teenage daughter. Okay, and I don't mean to be demeaning here, but you know what? We've got to give people doing difficult stuff the room to make a wrong turning. To make a wrong turning, understand that's a wrong turning, and turn back. They've done that once with the regulations we were supposed to be getting for LMP1.
I thought you were talking about Santino Ferrucci for a moment. My apologies.
I think where we are at the moment is I think they have learned some important lessons. We're going to know in probably months, not weeks, whether or not that was a correct decision. I think there is some good news to come, and I think there is further, maybe more troubling news to come from others that people might presume are going to go in one direction or another. And by the way...
You love One Direction, too. Any way you can squeeze that band into the conversation, Goodwin. Come on, man. It's getting to be a little predictable.
Take that. I think the reality here as well, and it's something I urge our listeners to take on board. Please do not go down the road of the lazy thinking that if a manufacturer says it's not going to do one thing, that it's definitely going to do something else. There are three choices for a manufacturer. Do plan A, do plan B, or do nothing. And in this day and age, do nothing has a lot of appeal.
Well, if that's the case, the manufacturer, the Pruett Automobile Company, would like to announce it's doing nothing and has plans to be the champion of nothing. Let's see. We're about an hour into this episode, and I feel compelled to say it's flown by for me, and it's been probably the most fun episode one of so far. So hopefully the second hour, which I'm hoping will contain the rest of the questions, will be just the same. And while we're here, let's take a little break. We'll be back right after this. PNC is proud to sponsor Scott Dixon, driver of the number 9 car for Chip Ganassi Racing. Scott knows that the road to victory lane starts today. Copyright 2018, the PNC Financial Services Group Incorporated. All rights reserved. PNC Bank, National Association, member FDIC. Graham, let's get into a couple of LMP1 questions. You will be seeing the beautiful, fastest prototypes in the world this weekend at Silverstone. And let's launch with our pal Ryan Terpstra. Ryan, thanks for always sending in great questions and supporting what we do. Mr. Goodwin, is the LMP1 race worth watching this weekend, or will it still be uncompetitive? And also, he says, where will Fernando Alonso be when the WEC qualifies for Sebring in 2019?
Well, the timing's ideal, isn't it, with the announcement today, Ryan? As we said at the top of the show, Fernando will be in a Toyota at Sebring. No doubt about that now whatsoever, stepping down from Formula One. Is the LMP race worth watching? Okay, number one, are the LMP1s worth watching? Hell yes. No better place in the world to watch them than Silverstone. If you're down at the circuit, get down to Beckett's, have a look at the way these things move through there. MP, still one of my beloved racing memories was you walking back into the Silverstone press room after seeing the hybrid cars come through at full chat for the first time through that fantastic sequence. And it is just mind-blowing, isn't it? These things move. They don't obey the laws of physics. So yes, the LMP cars are worth watching. As to whether or not the race is worth watching, well, actually, there's a neat segue here into a point and a question from Stuart Hart. We had one from Stuart earlier, who offers this opinion that the changes to EOT, the equivalency technology that we've seen for this weekend, is effectively what S&P Racing ran in pre-season testing before the prologue, which was the test, dear listeners, I should remind you, as to Stuart, that apparently spooked Toyota into pushing for more restrictions. His guess is that privateers, on the basis of the changes made, should gain 1 to 2 seconds on their Spa pace. In addition to that, remember, we've got a couple of cars which will be appearing for the first time this season. In fact, I think potentially all of the privateer cars will be appearing for the first time with their higher downforce kits. So is it going to be worth watching? We'll be learning this weekend. Do I think they'll get close to Toyota's pace? Closer, definitely. Will that be close enough? going to be interesting to see. We might get a drop or two of rain at various points through racing weekend. I think it's going to be interesting to see. I think there's more that could be done to equalise these cars. Whether or not it is done remains to be seen, but we're learning as we go with this new journey. I've been reasonably vocal in saying that, frankly, it moved way too far in, I'm going to say it again, one direction. But the reality here,
Harry and Zane, thank you for constantly big upping their band, by the way.
I can see people downloading those songs as I'm speaking. But the key, I think, here, MP, is that, as we said with the previous answer, lessons have been learned. They are responding. It's how quickly and whether or not the response is effective enough, which is going to be the proof of the pudding.
We've got a couple other LMP1 questions as well that would be ripe for you to flag. Do you want to grab a couple there? I know that Donald Ducky Howe wrote in as well. Let's see.
It's more or less the same question to start with. It basically is asking the same question about whether or not the non-hybrids are in for with a chance. Also says he almost fancies the LMS race more this weekend. If you've not had the opportunity to catch up with LMS racing this season or the last couple of seasons, I think you're in for a surprise. There are some stellar teams emerging here, and some of them are names that are perhaps less familiar to those people that perhaps only watch one or two endurance races in the year. Watch out for Decade Engineering, watch out for Racing Engineering, watch out for the Edex Sport Crew this weekend. These guys are coming forward rapidly in what is a growing pack of LMP2s in the European Le Mans Series, and we're now at the stage where those sorts of teams would not, and bear in mind these are year one teams in LMP2, would not be embarrassed in the kind of company that the WEC keeps. We're seeing a couple of really good drivers moving into WEC LMP2 competition as well. So don't forget the LMP2 side of things. Nick de Vries stepping into the tiny but not insubstantial shoes of Jan Lammers for the first time. And Davidson, with already name-checked, stepping in for Le Mans pole setter Nat Burton. These are LMP2 drivers of really high quality. So there's going to be lots of entertainment if you're trackside at Silverstone this weekend. Come and see the way these things are actually evolving, the way the racing is evolving. P2's quicker again this year. We've got tyre battles in both races between Michelin looking to step up and Dunlop. That in itself is a developing story, and particularly relevant, of course, MP, with Michelin putting their efforts into their LMP2 product with real relish this year, because that's what's coming to the United States for 2019.
So we kicked off the podcast with ketchup. We've just mentioned relish. Hopefully we will have a mustard reference before we're done here. And we might look forward to calling this the hot dog episode in weeks and months ahead. All right, let me see. What else can I find here for you, Monsieur Goodwin? That might be all kinds of fun. All right, see, I love a great get it right, Pruett question. Patrick McT. No, not McT. It's McTie. Yes, thank you. And I've gained the reputation as the last name assassin, and I appreciate the fact, Patrick, that you offered me up an easy one to get wrong. So full credit to you for being born with a last name that you knew all along one day Marshall Pruett would absolutely myrtleize.
Mangle.
Yeah.
Mangle. Yeah.
So I've been handling a lot of the IMSA stuff, but I'm going to throw this one back towards you, Graham. Patrick McTie says, guys, forgive me if this has already been asked, but Facebook won't let me see all the previous comments right now for some reason. Oh, I don't know what you did to Facebook, Patrick, but, you hear that? The Facebook cops are coming.
That's Facebook. Yep. The other way.
And just as a sidebar, my wife and I only live about 15 or 20 minutes from Facebook. They could be hearing what we're talking about and what we're writing. It says, with the JDC Miller Motorsports team getting a DPI Cadillac deal for next year, is there still any talk of a team running a Hyundai-branded DPI? Also, with ESM dropping their exclusivity on the Nissan brand, is there any speculation on who, if anyone, might also run Nissan DPIs next season? So I know you and I have caught up a little bit on the Hyundai end, and that was what the JDC team was looking at, but tell us what you know about whether that could survive beyond them and whether there's anyone in the queue for the Nissan.
Well, I think the answer is no and no immediately. However, the interesting part here is, I mean, for my understanding, and it was your story, MP, was that the Hyundai DPI prospect was led by the JDC Miller team looking for a solution for 2019. The interesting part here is, even if that particular well has dried up, clearly if they got the hooks into somebody at Hyundai, there's every prospect that anybody else that comes a knocking might find a rather more informed audience. Similarly, with the Nissan DPI side of things, again, something I know you've already covered off in your good writings, is that they are going to, I think, going to have to forgo the exclusivity on the Nissan power plant. Equally, we all know Nissan are going to have to do a rather better job of what's actually presented to customers with the various woes that have been handed down to ESM over recent weeks, with, frankly, a power plant that just should not be having those sorts of issues. I have a kind of slightly detached and, one might say, controversial viewpoint at the moment, which is we've been through a year where you almost had, it was a bit like politics either side of the Atlantic at the moment. You've got to take a side. You're either on the side of LMP1 or DPI. I don't play that game. For me, you look at it in cold, hard facts. And I think what we've seen in recent weeks is that it was a braver call at the point at which it was finally made by IMSA to divide those two classes. Why? Because without knowing if there's something under wraps that's about to be revealed for 2019, I'm pretty certain that something that people believe is going to be unwrapped isn't. I'm not as certain as some appear to be that the DPI formula has got as much short-term depth as many people believe it might have. I do think we've got programs that need to start to produce results pretty darn quickly. I know we've talked about Mazda in the past. We've talked about the state of play in terms of the potential for customer this or customer that. There are weak points in that product that need to be addressed if it's going to be maintained as the strong, fluid, in a positive way, formula that we've been talking about for much of this year. That's not to say it's on its knees. It absolutely isn't. Neither is it the card-carrying, flag-waving global success that I think some people would have you believe at the moment. There are cracks there, some of which are being effectively papered over, but the Tequila Patron announcement, I think, was a pretty big blow. The fact that it's Cadillac that is servicing the JDC Miller thing is great, wonderful, but it's Cadillac. It's effectively one more Cadillac. If what we believe is going to happen across the full season is going to happen across the full season, this is not the level of growth I think that you guys out there on the, if you like, on the other side of the fence in motorsport we're expecting coming into year two. Hope I'm wrong. Hope there's something big that we might be hearing for 2019. Fear that may not be the case.
And I'll just add quickly to the Hyundai side again, that was something that the Gainsco side of the number 99 JDC Miller effort, that being led by Bob Stallings, that's something where through Bob's long-standing relationship as both a entrant using factory GM prototypes and as a longtime dealer of Hyundai automobiles, he's been down both paths. So I realize that I might be repeating something you've heard on past episodes, already know, but trying to keep in mind that some folks are listening in for the first time. We have had Bob race under the Chevrolet, race under the Pontiac banner as well during the Grand Am Daytona prototype years. Started off in the new IMSA, the combined Grand Am and ALMS thing we now call IMSA in 2014. That didn't last long. Their Corvette DPI was destroyed in the big crash that Memo Gidley had, and they effectively moved on to other things. But the next product after that, they came up with on their own, working with Hyundai. The Bob Stallings Gainsco Racing team paid for the vast majority of everything to build a Pirelli World Challenge GTS Hyundai Genesis V6 powered thing. But this was done through relationships with the factory. And so that is where Bob, in the conversation we had, whatever it was, a month or two ago, he said, hey, we're not sure what we're going to do next year, but we want it to be a DPI. And we are going to talk with my friends at General Motors, whether that's an option. But we're also exploring doing, like ESM has done with Nissan, putting together our own Hyundai-based DPI program. The minute that we saw the JDC Miller team was going the Cadillac route, Graham, that told us that the Hyundai route was no longer an option. And yeah, if we're looking at the Nissan side, knowing that those cars are built on the Ligier JSP 217, you would think that if a team did want to go the DPI route, it would most likely be an AFS PR1 Matheson, which has that exact spec P2 model. Could it be a United Autosports if they wanted to convert their Ligier that they keep here in the U.S. for use as a Nissan DPI? Just saying, not as if someone couldn't buy one brand new, but for those who might want to convert up from a spec P2, there are a couple of teams that could do that. Just a question of whether the price to do that makes sense and whether they feel, as Graham mentioned, especially on the engine side, things are reliable enough to warrant the exercise.
Well, all of that speaks actually to, I just noticed a question from Andrew Backer who was asking whether or not the IMSA split prototype class has put IMSA into that risky situation of the WC 2 years ago. That's more or less exactly the same point I'm just making, so apologies, Andrew. I should have just read your question, depending almost entirely on manufacturer's top class. There's another great question, by the way, which moves on from this and speaks beautifully to the area that I know you hold very dear, MP, from Nathan Brown, long-time listener, first-time commenter.
Thanks, Nathan.
Hey. And for the opening up of the DPI formula, discussion last week about whether or not the Nissan and Mazda DPI engines will be able to reliably make enough power to stay with the caddies. The Acuras seems an odd problem since years ago in the GTP glory days. You have the diminutive Toyota 4-pot making massive power, doing it reliably enough to win Enduros like Daytona and Sebring and the whole championship. Likewise, the MPTI Nissans were powerful and practically bulletproof. To his knowledge, both were more or less stock block based compared to today, really old tech in terms of turbo design, engine management and fueling. Given all this, what do you think modern engines would have trouble making more reliable power?
Yeah, the reputation of those motors being stock block in the GTP days, I would say that while the intent was stock block maybe to start as things blew up a lot, and 800, 900, 1,000 horsepower was what was needed to be competitive, there wasn't a stock thing to be found anywhere in those power plants, Graham. And that's not pushing back at all. It's just saying that the desire to try and use road-based stuff and have that be a marketing angle, that was dispatched fairly quickly as teams realized, holy cow, to play at the power levels and speed that we need, no, we've got to go as custom as can be. So the costs involved back then compared to today with what AER is doing with the four-cylinder engine, turbo engine from Mazda, and also what Nismo is doing with its GT3, or road-based but GTR-based GT3 engine. Yeah, we are not talking about something cost-wise that is even in the vaguest hemisphere of what was required to find reliability and maintain reliability in the GTP era. So if budgets were different, then I would say there'd be no question. I do have a mild concern that as IMSA separates the classes, and as you alluded to in the question, as IMSA separates these classes, takes the BOP shackles off of the DPIs, and they are, I believe, will be allowed to make more of the power that they were intended to, could that start to stress things even more? And my guess is that's going to be a big topic of conversation during, right now, but throughout the off-season, as IMSA determines what it wants the level to be, Graham, for the DPIs with power and whatever separation might exist between DPIs and P2s strictly through the regulations and what IMSA chooses to do there. I'm positive that, frankly, every manufacturer is probably going to push back a little bit and say, hey, love the idea, thanks, this is what we've wanted, but let's not take the power to places where we're going to be blowing up all the time, because we've kind of sort of found a sweet spot that works. We might not want to stray too far from that. So I just think that's going to be a big part of the conversation on where the two classes end up for speed.
I completely agree. And there's a couple of further questions, both of which are based around the Mazda program. David Zitterbar asking whether or not we might, in that scenario, see the return of the Wankel rotary engine. No, I don't think so. There's no existing...
We dream of it, David.
No existing Mazda road car with a Wankel. I'm afraid those days are gone. Much loved soundtrack, I know, and Max Radke. Asking whether or not they could be competitive with a changing power plant. We don't yet know whether or not they can't be competitive with the one they've got. Things are moving forward, perhaps not as quickly as we would like and you would like, and I'm sure John Doonan and the US racing guys would like, but they are certainly moving forward. It's a brave new world coming, isn't it? Here's one from Tom Wilfler. Hello, gents. Are the JDC Cadillacs at another team's expense, or has Cadillac made more cars available?
From what I understand, those will be new cars that are delivered, not, for example, the one that Wayne Taylor put up for sale. I have been told by Mr. Taylor that car is not meant to be, that car is not going to be headed to JDC, because I did have that same question. So from what I understand, could be wrong, but from what I understand, new models will be manufactured and shipped their way during the off-season.
Excellent stuff. And one from Thomas Pendergrass. Would it be feasible to drop the larger Gibson LMP1 engine into an LMP1 creating a Gibson DPI? I think he means an LMP2 creating a Gibson DPI. There's absolutely no reason, as far as I'm aware, why a team shouldn't badge that engine as whatever they like. Is there, in DPI regulation?
I think they could. I mean, the reality is Mazda came up with a brand new engine. Well, AER on Mazda's behalf came up with a brand new engine. The GTR GT3 engine is obviously a pre-existing power plant that was dropped in. Acura's road-based twin-turbo V6 has been around for quite a while, both LMP2 form stroked up to DP form at 3.5 liters, which it is now. That has road-going relevance to the Acura MDX and I think RDX crossover vehicles, but they're not GT3. It's not a GT3 spec engine. It is more of kind of a LMP2 derived thing. Cadillac's motor, I believe, has, road lineage, obviously, but that was more a byproduct and work effort from the GM powertrain side, the racing side there. Mazda's come up with something brand new because that's allowed in IMSA's regulations. So I would say, honestly, with what IMSA permits, you can go in a variety of routes here, and if you want to do something that is custom-ish, they appear likely and willing to allow that in. And if you want to stick with something a little more road-based, you could do that too. So a little bit open there. A little bit open.
Well, looking up and down the questions, you've got about half an hour before I've got to go and eat some Indian food. It's a really important part of my sense of well-being this evening. We're clearing up on LMP1, on DPI. There's one here for you to actually decide whether to answer. Is there a rumoured Ford DPI project? If so, what chassis would they be likely to go with, given the Riley Multimatic P2 not quite right? Is Riley still trying to sell the chassis as well? I'll answer the last bit. It's not Riley trying to sell the chassis because Multimatic now control that program. As for Ford MP...
We definitely know rumors, and more than just a rumor. Myself, Jamie Howe from Fox, and John DeGeese from his media outlet, we were invited to a breakfast with Ford Global Motorsports Director Mark Rushbrook at Sebring. I think it might have been Friday morning there, so this would have been in March. And it was just a come have a nice breakfast, Thank you for it, by the way. It was some lovely little breakfasty bits there. But come have breakfast with Mark and our Ford Performance team and ask all the questions you want. You may even get some answers to them. Kidding aside, Mark, who's a delightful person, was very accommodating. And looking back, now, granted, it might be a mere coincidence that I have this paragraph sitting right in front of me now, and it wasn't because I was preparing for the podcast. It might be something that I mentioned I'm publishing in the morning. Mark did tell us then, and this was went up on Racer then, and I think other outlets too. He said, like the GT, we can take that same car and apply it racing in IMSA and the WC around the world very efficiently. And he was referring to what interest Ford might have on the common, what we then thought were going to be common ACO, FIA, and IMSA top-tier prototype regulations. Mark said, ultimately, what we'd like to see in prototype that would make us interested would be a common set of rules so we can run it in the WC, run it in IMSA, and run 3 or 4 cars at Le Mans. So in March, before the press conference at Le Mans, where it was very clear that our French friends have no interest in doing what we thought they might do with working with IMSA closely on something that built off of DPI regulations, Mark said, hey, if it is a common thing and it's used on both sides of the Atlantic, we would be very interested. Have a pretty good direction, Graham, on where that's headed, which could lead us to where it sounds like things either will or won't go with a Ford DPI style effort. So I would suggest that since this is going to go up today on Thursday, that if you're to check back on racer.com tomorrow morning, U.S. time, California, East Coast, whatever it might be, you will probably see a little bit of a further point applied to that topic. So, and I have not heard much about someone trying to get a Riley Multimatic Mark 30 to run in IMSA or the WEC or any other championship at this point. That being said, though, they sure have made a lot of gains with the Mazda from year to year. Overhaul completely on the suspension side, in particular at the rear. Cooling, vastly improved. There are some other things that I think could still be tidied up, but they're not allowed to do per the rules. But I can say that chassis has come quite a long ways. And we did see one run at Daytona with Bar 1, which that was not the most complimentary effort we've seen put out in a while. But I would be intrigued, Graham, just because I'm that type of guy. Would be curious to see how that car might run at a shorter track where it's higher downforce and higher drag numbers would probably be a big benefit compared to reliability.
And here's a bit of a sadness about the fact that that went so badly at Daytona. As Brian Alder told me before the race that, look, you know, we're pushing forward. There's a big step been taken with the car in the off-season as a spin-off benefit from what had been done with re-engineering the DPI, and that they were actively talking at that stage about the potential for, by mid-season, for a second car. Sadly, I'm afraid that's now history. Real shame, and, you know, I'm afraid, are you listening, ACO, a weakness of your strategy to have just 4 chassis manufacturers. You know, I think there's always the risk this might happen, and that risk is still there. We have the Ligiers being closer in LMP2 form than they were, the same to a lesser degree from the Dalaras, but I'm hearing Dalara are in active conversation at the moment about getting another tweak approved by the FIA to deal with a handling issue that still exists even after the Joker upgrades to the P217 chassis. So, you know, lessons again there to be learned the next time we go around this merry-go-round. Vast majority of what's left here are rather on the more whimsical or opinion-led
Graham,
side of things.
Before we get to that, let me grab a couple on GT, just because we've been talking about prototype lots and lots, and we need to restore balance to the force. So let's go with Corey Showmaker, who says, hey guys, after the rough play of the number 63 Scuderia Corsa Ferrari, is this week's BOP more performance or putative? He says, I hate to suggest it, but it seems sudden and not based on, quote, performance. And Corey is referring to, for this weekend's GT-only festival at VIR, bunch of performance tables came out, Graham. There was one vehicle listed for change, and that was the Ferrari 488 GT3, and it has had some turbo boost taken away, and it has had 2 liters, I believe, of fuel taken away, and there's always some sort of match. If they provide extra power, there'll be a complimentary addition of fuel to burn, or vice versa. So in this case, power was taken away and fuel. I have to admit, Corey, I can't recall the 488 looking like a world beater this year on many occasions in GT Daytona. I'm not saying the car isn't capable, just as we know under the BOP restraints, any vehicle's performance is limited or allowed based on what the BOP tables happen to say. So for me personally, I had the same reaction of, wonder why the Ferrari's getting bopped on the head when it didn't look like something that was standing out, to me at least, as one that we might fear as a runaway winner coming up here at VIR. Granted, we aren't the people with all the data coming up with the BOP regulations, so just because it stood out as a bit odd to me doesn't mean IMSA was wrong. And Graham, what's the best part? We're going to know by the end of the weekend whether the curiosity was well placed, or we should just shut up and they had it right all along.
Well, I'll tell you what, actually, segueing beautifully with that is a question from Nathan Barnes at the top of the list here, which is, with so much sports car racing coming up this weekend, how do you even choose what to watch? Do you catch replays of what you can and watch as much live as possible? Do you pay any mind to any of the races you aren't at on the weekends? You're on site for a meeting. Love the podcast. Thank you very much, Nathan. And points apparently to me for pronouncing his last name correctly. It's a bit of a rarity.
I'm the murderer. You're the dead shot man. You are the sniper of last name accuracy. See, look at this.
Well, I can tell you from my perspective, we do on occasion watch back races simply because we have a fairly extensive group of stringer writers around the world, but not that can cover absolutely everything. And some of the race reports that we do picked up principally with DSC by Stephen Kilby, who's my kind of partner in crime at DSC Central, to make sure that we can get some form of not press release material to you guys. I mean, this weekend, for instance, IMSA, VLN, ELMS, WEC, I'll have crews at 3 separate race meetings this weekend, and others reporting from distance. In other words, that we'll be watching a telecast from that. I don't tend to spend much of my week watching races back on TV, and there's a very good reason for that. Life is extremely busy, running for me a couple of different companies. Family life as well has got to take its part in the great scheme of things, and as somebody will know, family life in the Goodwin household has been really very busy over the last couple of years. But no, I don't watch wall-to-wall motorsport. That said, I always say to people working with us and alongside us, whenever life is becoming difficult, a race meeting and stress levels come up, I have a stock phrase, which is, guys, you could be working down a coal mine. Just remember just what a privilege this is to do this. What the guys do in the press room, if they're doing it properly, is incredibly hard work. It is intellectually challenging. The working hours are as opposed to 9 to 5 as you could possibly imagine. But everybody that comes and stays working with me, and I know it's the same with you, MP, has to have one, beyond talent and ability, has to have one defining characteristic. And those that don't have it don't last long. And that is passion. They've got to be absolutely passionate about this one. And they've got to remember that you, some of the guys listening in to this podcast, would love an opportunity to do what they do.
I was going to say sexiness, but once again, I was absolutely wrong. That's okay. We're accustomed to that. I would say that for me, personally, sorry, I couldn't resist. I look at as much motor racing as my brain can process. I need to be honest in saying that as I grow older, I find the amount that I can process is actually reducing. And I don't know if I need to take some different vitamins to make my brain work better and remember things gooder. But there is a bit of a limit that I've found, Graham, where it's not just a retention standpoint. Maybe it's a juggle everything that I'm seeing happening in front of me, contextualize it in a way to write about it, look for the themes to explore as sidebars afterwards, look at the greater themes that might go into a commentary afterwards, look at some of the news that might come out of this that we can turn into something, reach back to the things that you and I and other journalists know and sit on either under embargo, which is less often, but more, hey, we know this thing's in motion, and how might it tie into this thing that I just saw happen, and could that get rolled into a news item? Is the timing ready for that? That's a pretty standard thing, plus the, do I need to go shoot photos of the thing? Am I doing videos of the thing, producing those? How do those fit into the matrix of whatever it is we're trying to cover and present? What do people like to read? What do they like to listen to? What do they like to watch? Is this nerdy thing that I might do over here that I love, would spending a half hour or an hour creating it, capturing it, producing it, and putting it up, would it be of any real value to my client? Right? If it's going to get 17 reads or 14 views, the answer is no, so maybe that thing falls off the list. When you apply all of those things that you and I and pick all the other racing outlets and, any frankly, journalist who does regular reporting of sporting events, you weigh all those things for a single series, and it can make your brain start to sweat. Then you start to think about, well, but am I covering 2 series? Am I covering 3? This weekend, you're going to have the WEC and ELMS. This weekend, I'm actually going to be going down to Monterey for what they call the Prehistorics, the event the weekend prior to the large reunion event, and doing some stuff there I might only be going down on Sunday. I'm not sure if it's both, but I'll be going down there to do some stuff, capture some stuff specifically with the Mirage, the M12 Mirage, that cleared scrutineering at Le Mans in 1982 with Michael and Mario Andretti, and was then denied the ability to compete. Doing some fun stuff there with my friend Harley Cluxton, who is the entrant on that car, while also needing to look at the schedule during Sunday, specifically, Graham, knowing that I will need to get back to the media center to watch the VIR IMSA race as much as possible, so I can write about that, although I'm at a different event. And there's the IndyCar Pocono 500 event, which I'm not covering, but I know that I'm going to need to follow for the Week in IndyCar podcast, and there will be stories that I will probably follow up on from there. So everything I just mentioned kind of sort of falls into the how do you choose what to cover, what to do, what to track. Most of us are not able to be specialized in one single category, have a lot of things to juggle, and at least for me, the reason that we talk about endurance racing here primarily, instead of also sprint racing, and go heavily into Blancpain and Pirelli World Challenge, I just don't have the mental ability to be an authority on those things, in addition to the WEC, in addition to IMSA, and to feel like we could do them properly. So I apologize for the long answer there, but just trying to give a picture of how do we do what we do, and how do we decide what factors are involved. It's not that hard. It's just a lot to juggle.
I think the other thing to say is there's never been a period in history where you, the listener, as a fan, can follow as much globally as we now can. It is highly unusual for there not to be some form of TV or streaming service available for any kind of national or higher race series, whether or not single-seaters, whether or not it's touring cars, whether or not it's sports cars, endurance racing. Just about everything has some form of streaming service. If it doesn't have that, it's probably got live timing. It's very unusual for it not to. I actually did spend part of my working weekend in the office with the second screen, watching the Masters Endurance Legends from the Nürburgring this weekend, where, by the way, in Lola's 60th anniversary year, a pair of Lolas won the two races. Steve Tandy, no, not any relation to Nick, taking a win in the Mazda-engined ex-Dyson Racing Lola, and then the second race falling to a glorious Lola Aston Martin V8. Oh, dear me, I've come over all peculiar. But, I do have sometimes these kind of things on in the background simply because it's entertainment, not because I'm reporting on it, because I'm just interested to see
quit
shiny
laughing, Goodwin. It's keeping the murderous voices in your mind at bay. That's all it is. It's murder abatement. That's what it is.
Comes back to it, and we're into the final 10 minutes here, MP. And John D has actually said on the back of
John
brilliant. John D.
Is this someone who likes sports cars at least 364 days out of the year, John D, or a different one?
There you go. John D. Okay. Loved your fantasy historic race series idea last week. Which 5 circuits are you bringing it to, and which 3?
Oh, you're killing us, John. But great point, Graham. Let's close out with some of the fun, silly stuff. Well, since I had the great idea apparently last week, sucker, you get to answer this one.
Oh, 5 circuits. Nürburgring, obviously, the proper one. Brands Hatch, because I love the place. It's very, very special to me. You've got to say Spa, as long as you don't have to go in the press room. Monza, absolutely mind-blowingly wonderful place. Bathurst. Ooh. They're the 5. Which 3 eras of racing? And by the way, all of this without any heed paid whatsoever to the prevailing safety standards. Which era? Group C, for me, I will go to my grave knowing that was a missed opportunity for me. I just wasn't at a place in my life when that was happening, where that was an option for me. Principally because I cannot tell you how busy my professional life was at the time, and I wasn't at that stage a professional journalist. Family life was at a point where travel would have been next to impossible as well. But for me, I did go and see a couple of Group C races, but it was a couple, and I will go to my grave regretting that. So Group C, without a shadow of a doubt.
Can I throw one in of your 3? Can I throw one in? I would say 1995 through 1996 DTM/ITC, the peak of the all-time peak so far, I believe. Maybe the most recent LMP1 hybrids have trumped it in some capacities, but definitely still the all-time peak for technology, craziness. You speak with Dario Franchitti, Bernd Schneider, Ollie Gavin, Tony Kanaan, anybody who drove those cars, let me remove Bernd Schneider, anyone who drove those cars just specifically in that era and didn't really, have something before it to measure it against and afterwards, they light up as if we're talking about their personal golden era. And these are folks who've won everything. Dario, 3-time Indy 500 winner, not diminishing those things. But you ask him to tell tales about his time as a factory Mercedes pilot in the all-time high-tech DTM era, and his eyes are like saucers because there's just this, if only you could have been me, it was that amazing type reverie. So I would throw that one in.
Well, here you go, and I'll add in for my final 3 as a mixed grid with those cars and the BPR from the same era before it went bonkers with GT1, when we had the F40s, when we had the short and then the long tail McLarens, when that was all just becoming, it's like when you get the bacon perfect. It's when it gets just that level of crispiness before you get the burn. That's exactly those with those ITC cars. What an era! What an era! And by the way, all the media shuttles have got to be Group B rally cars.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that is brilliant.
Actually, that segues beautifully into Patrick Thomas's question, because we've got a couple of questions, by the way, about DTM.
See,
Joseph Ostrowski
why didn't
asking
you
about.
let me pick Patrick? Because at least I could have gotten
Yeah,
his last name right. But go ahead.
absolutely.
Go ahead.
Joseph Ostrowski asking about Brands Hatch hosting DTM and British GT in the last couple of weeks. He thought the British GT actually attracted more fans, which the two would rather attend. But probably DTM, because it's not something I regularly go to, and I do like the novelty. But British GT it's like putting on a comfortable pair of shoes. Wandering down the pit lane of the paddock is a nice thing when you know lots of people, and you can come away with lots of juicy gossip, some of which we can actually print. But Patrick, Fantasy Time, MP and GG. This may be, if not the last question, the penultimate one, MP. With Mercedes pulling out of DTM at the end of the year, what two cars would you pick to replace the Mercs? We're not allowed to say Aston Martin, by the way, because that one still sits on the burner. It can be any two manufacturers, doesn't have to be German. His two picks would be the Alfa Romeo Giulia, because what's motor racing without some Italian flair, and the Kia Stinger, mainly because it just looks mean. And sitting behind one on a red light on the way home inspired the question. Brilliant reason for asking, Patrick. You want to choose one? I'll choose one.
I will, and this might be the most baller DTM car ever if it were to happen. Having seen what our friends in Crew can do with a GT3 version of the Bentley Continental, could you imagine it? Frankly, a little bit like what MP thinks future GTE, GTLM regulations should look like body-wise. Flared out, faceted, wacky, crazy-looking Bentley Continental DTM. I mean, you would need to have the paddles nearby at all times to restart my heart if that thing ever came to life.
That is the answer, isn't it? It's almost unbeatable. There was that stillborn project in the very dark days at the end of MG Rover, where there might possibly have been an MG ZT based on the Rover 75. That would have been something to see. I'm not sure I can do better than that. Is the absolute
all right
honest answer. But let's try.
I'll grab John Sable, who again, just thank you, John, for being such a consistent and gracious supporter of what we do here with great questions each week. Let's give the last question to John, and it will allow us to wax until we have to cut off here so you can go have curry with Lordy.
Oh, yeah.
John says, I'm going to try and make this question as existential as I can. Has technology hurt racing? And if so, was there a period in time where the level of technology created the, quote, best racing? And if so, what was the technological breakthrough that became the tipping point and began the diminishing returns?
That's a massive question, isn't it?
And we'll see what we can do in 4 minutes. Why don't you take?
I'll give you my first answer. First answer, and it's a very recent one, and we've talked about it before. No doubt in my mind that in the very modern era, the defining moment where technology ultimately became an issue, but LMP1 hybrid. We found out, as a species, what worked best in that area of performance. 3 mighty powerhouses came up with 3 very different answers to the same set of regulations, and yet we had fantastic racing. It didn't last long. It's like one of those fireworks that, as a Roman candle punches something up into the stratosphere, and we all go, ooh, and then we're waiting for the next one, and it's just one. But in this instance, I cannot tell you what a privilege it was to stand and tell an audience how good that was. It was just fantastic. It's what I've been waiting for in sports car racing, probably since the mid-90s. Absolutely fantastic period of 2, 3, 4 years where it just was right before the crazy took over. And at that point, the diminishing returns, I'm afraid, John, did actually rather take over the asylum.
I'm going to go back further than that by a couple decades, Graham, to close. So, John, and I'm not the first person to cite this. I definitely watched it come in when it really changed the landscape of motor racing and now the automotive industry. And that would be 1989 Formula One World Championship. Ferrari and its, I believe it was the 649 chassis, and its semi-automatic gearbox. Finger-controlled paddle shift up and down. That is something that today you folks just expect that as the norm. Back then, it was, as I recall, not saying this is historically accurate, meaning it never happened before in the sport, but this to me was a very different thing in terms of technology, maybe starting to tip things in a questionable direction. We've had, prior to that, a couple years prior, and in other iterations, active suspension, for example, trying to optimize the aerodynamics by automating the suspension actuation. To me, I love that because that is taking something that was static in terms of not directly manipulable by the driver and trying to optimize that through technological controls. Where the paddle shifting, to me, really started to take things in a questionable direction is this was an effort by Ferrari, which then became adopted paddock-wide and is now just the norm, where the thought was, what human thing can we look at to change and improve and find a performance advantage by removing this function from the driver's hands? And around this time, it might even be the same year, I apologize if I'm off on my exact year, but Graham, traction control was another thing that started to come in. Hey, driver, using that right foot to manipulate throttle to either spin or not spin the rear tires, how could we use electronics to manage that? I really look at that late 80s era as a point where questions of what human things are being done that we could optimize if a computer and or automated type system handled this. And I look at where we are today, where so many things, you climb into a car, most cars, put it in drive and or use the paddle shifters, and it has automated everything that takes the driving, any concern so much out of your hands. And maybe this is too existential to close, John, but I think part of the questions of, do people care about cars anymore? Does the young generation have any attachment? Is this going to die as a sport because people don't care about seeing cars race because too many people grow up not caring about them today? I wonder if we look back to this late 80s point, Graham, to close as a turning point where when folks started saying, what human things could we take away in the sake of performance optimization, that we created a monster where so much has been taken away. Cars aren't as visceral and analog and personal as they once were.
I enjoyed that one. Can I just say, by the way, thank you for those of you that continue to support this, and an expanding number of you with some brilliant questions. As I say, I think more than ever this week, and apologies to those of you we didn't get to this week. Do keep trying, because we will get to one of them at some point pretty soon. I got that as getting through something like 30 questions in the just under 2 hours, and a fantastic range of subject matter as well. So thanks again for supporting this, and tell your friends.
And thank you. I hope you enjoyed this format, and if so, keep sending us notes saying yes or no. And if this is something that is the prevailing wisdom to keep doing this mostly QA-driven format for the Week in Sports Cars, then that is indeed what we will keep doing. All right. I am Marshall Pruett. That is Graham Goodwin. This is the Week in Sports Cars, presented by Cooper Tires, supported by PNC Bank. Thank you for listening. We'll speak to you next week.